In South Korea right now, everyone is talking about one TV series which is called Super China. The 7-episode documentary aired on South Korean state broadcaster KBS and has proved a huge hit with audiences. The series aimed to give a comprehensive view of China in the 21st century.
China on the rise. Super China has shone a spotlight on South Korea's powerful neighbor, and it sparked a huge wave of interest in all things China.
The two countries have become much more familiar with one another since bilateral ties were enhanced 23 years ago, but the level of understanding doesn't go very deep. We produced this documentary to help people to get to know China better.
The series serves as an introduction to China as a whole, covering topics ranging from population and economics to geography to diplomatic relations and cultural soft power.
The most impressive thing about China whenever you talk about it is the giant area and population. So the documentary started with population. After the founding of the new China in 1949, the Communist Party of China has been the main leading force in China's development. So the documentary ends with the leadership of CPC.
The documentary was watched by 10% of the viewing audience, double the average rating for documentaries aired in South Korea. Many say Super China marks a step forward in gaining a deeper understanding of the real China among South Koreans.
I lived in China for 10 years, but I still learned something I didn't know about the country through this documentary. I used to think China's development relied on low quality and low priced products. But now I feel that China is a high value brand.
Some South Koreans are a little apprehensive about China's growing power, subscribing to the narrative of China as a threat. But many experts believe China's rise is good news for South Korea.
China's rise is inevitable, but it should also be prepared for other countries concerned. But I believe China's rise will be a peaceful one.
With Beijing and Seoul getting closer in recent years, exchanges between the two countries have never been higher. And the Super China documentary may well help South Koreans gain a deeper understanding of their neighbor and what its rise might mean for the future.
And for more on the topic, we are joined in the Beijing studio by Ms. Duan Yanling, who is the CEO of Duya Communication. That's, I think, a PR firm based in Beijing. And also in Seoul, we have Professor Oh Ying-yu from the Korea University. Welcome to both of you to our program. First of all, Professor Oh, I understand from some information provided by our South Korean colleagues, the viewing of this documentary, Super China, in fact, doubled the average of ratings of documentary, shall we say, being put on in South Korea. Is that true, first of all? Because, you know, everybody is proud of their own products. We don't know about this number. And secondly, isn't that an interesting phenomenon if South Koreans just begin to think about China? I thought South Koreans already thought about China, viewing about China, analyzing about China a long time ago, at least hundreds and thousands of years ago. Professor.
Yeah, I agree with your comment. Yes, I agree with your comment that South Korean people have been very close to Chinese culture, Chinese history, and Chinese social phenomena overall. The recent phenomenon of this documentary thing is again a sample-based research. It doesn't really reflect the whole population's viewing attitudes. But nonetheless, it's a great record of 10% watching this particular documentary. But it only reaffirms our belief that two countries' historical relationship has been recently more deepened because of these new exposures to Chinese culture and history.
May I just follow up a little bit, because the question of whether China is a threat or an attraction has been raised in that specific documentary, not directly, but certainly all throughout the story. But then that question has been asked by people elsewhere in the world, and many in China would just wonder, is there any new content when it comes to the answer of this question from South Koreans? Because South Koreans certainly knows better than many others around the world about China.
I think it is a new development in Korea these days, because Koreans are now gradually realizing that China has really been rapidly modernized, and is now in neck and neck in an economic race with the United States and other Western countries, especially also Japan as well. So it has been now really felt among Koreans by watching these documentary series. It's not just the rumors from some people who travel China, but they now visualize the real image of development, and which is in a positive direction, because it's not threatening anymore, but more becoming equal and similar to each other. So I think East Asia is becoming more similar than before, which is fundamentally reducing the feelings of threats or fears of threats, rather.
Ms. Duan, interesting what Professor Oh just said.
Absolutely.
But better understanding doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to feel less threat about one another, but rather more friendly toward each other.
I think Korea and China definitely has been much more closer. And frankly, if you look at the visual languages documentary, I thought it was a CCTV work with a Korean subtitle in it at the first glance. But the understanding culturally is much closer. So I think the most interesting with this documentary is it really provides another perspective. Before we know CCTV, Chinese media, we have a very positive tone of voice of who we are, how strong we are becoming. And the rest, to be frankly, there's always rather negative tones of voice and the other angles. And this Korean tone of voice and narrative has taken a completely new angle. The storytelling is very interesting as well, but I think the basis is because it's starting from a more understanding and much more common interest tone of voice and explore opportunities rather than look at it as a threat. I think that kind of, we try to be objective, any documentary is, but every creation is a product of people. So I think there's still kind of emotional tie behind that ball. I don't know if the producers are going to agree, but that's what I feel as a viewer.
Right. This is an interesting sample we are looking at. Is a cultural product, and
Absolutely.
we are trying to look at whether this cultural product in a way represent or reflect any kinds of sentiment that has been evolving inside the two countries. On that point, going back to you, Professor Oh, we noticed that the South Korean president, Park Geun-hye, has been quite friendly toward the Chinese culture. She's been coming to China several times. She's also been reading Chinese philosophical works from the ancient times. She said that really opened her up in a way when she was at the most difficult time of her life, which is when her father just got killed, and together with mother. So that, of course, is coming from the leadership. But what about from the grassroots level? How much of the sentiment inside this documentary really reflect what common people are thinking?
Well, I could notice in recent years in Korea that more and more people are now recovering the traditional Chinese culture again, reopening their dust-filled books of Confucianism, and rereading all the ancient Chinese history books. There is a rejuvenation of Chinese cultural boom in Korea. If you look at all the bookstores in downtown Seoul, one of the best-seller bookshelves is usually filled with some sort of Chinese stories. Some
really?
Sort of Chinese
what is your
ancient history
favorite?
Books, or cultural books. So I see
What is your favorite?
I see a renaissance of Chinese culture in Korea in recent years.
Professor, I'm trying to ask, what is your favorite?
I love the stories of, I don't know how to pronounce in Chinese, but it's called Western Trips.
Journey to the West. Wow, that's a
Song.
fascinating story about a monkey going all the way to India together with all of the believers of Buddhism. It's a beautiful story. Yes, it's fun. We're going to talk about that story maybe some other time. But come back to you, Ms. Duan. Just like Professor said, how would you think one specific cultural product would, in a way, influence or impact one person's overall understanding about another culture or about people from a distant land, even though China and South Korea is not that far away from one another, but still.
I think we have seen this Korean culture bombard us in China for the past 10 years.
You use bombarded
Yes,
us.
yes,
Well,
it's,
they are embracing the Chinese culture. You're using the negative tone.
Embracing means you have no knowledge, you have some knowledge of trying to be attracted. I think Chinese modern culture was a blank page when Korean culture arrived with music, fashion, soap opera, melodrama. So I think we're already immersed and tremendously bombarded by Korean culture, modern culture. So it's probably now is a time to have a little more
interesting, isn't it, that the Chinese are only discovering our ancient culture through the eyes of the others, while embracing the modern or contemporary culture of the others. And it's just such an interesting cultural phenomenon. It is very interesting. Coming back to you, Mr. Oh, but we talk about, the common ground, but there were times when it seems there are some sentiments going on in both countries claiming certain kinds of parts of our culture has been invented or belong to the Chinese culture or the Korean culture. For example, the debate about the Dragon Boat Festival, claiming to the UNESCO as to which one it originated from. How does that work with what you have just described, a fascination about Chinese ancient culture inside Korea? How does these two work together?
Well, you have to separate those two segments in society. It happens in any society because on the one hand, many Koreans do worship and respect Chinese culture. We have learned a lot from China. And our language has about 60% of vocabularies coming from Chinese letters. So those are the fact of this Korean society. The other fact is every society has some sort of nationalist fervor. So these nationalists, maybe ultra-nationalists, would argue that some of the cultural artifacts actually were invented by Koreans, not coming from China. But so you have to separate these two. Do not mix them together, please.
Right. We do see, Professor, on the one hand, you got China play a part in the six-party talks, which of course is an important issue for the Korean Peninsula. We also see China and South Korea try to work out this free trade agreement, which is also very important for both countries. And we also see leadership in both countries very friendly toward one another over the past few years. So many are wondering, you are a scholar in this field, how much really does national interest and politics have its impact on the overall feeling, natural feeling between two countries? Briefly from you.
I think politics is really important in this matter. If two leaders are very friendly, that would affect the overall national sentiments about our neighbors. But now we really have to change our perspective from a developing and modernizing perspective of trying to be independent from each other, trying to be more developed than before. But rather we have to change our perspective to a more like a postmodern perspective, which is embracing each other's culture, appreciating each other's culture, so that we can develop more friendly and peaceful future in our neighborhood.
Right. Having a bigger heart, that's exactly what you're saying, it seems, Professor. Can the Chinese also have a bigger heart, not just fascinated by another culture, but also embrace the real nature of the others?
I guess you have to learn first, and interest is number one. I think we'll show each other already, and now this product shows also we already reached a certain maturity of understanding of each other. But the next day, probably it also offer a good example for our media professionals, counterparts in China, how to really understand another culture or export so-called self-power in a more international perspective and be embraced by more. I think that's really something we do leave us to think about. And
well, we are not only having fascination about one another, but also, people from originally coming the other's place. For example, the Korean minorities here in China, they are teaching us a lot about the Korean culture. And we are coming to the end of this fascinating discussion. I hope our cultural discussion can ever go on. But for now, I would like to thank the two of you for this wonderful discussion. Ms. Duan Yanling here in Beijing, and also Professor Ong Ying-yu from the Korea University in Seoul. Thank you so much for being with us.